Today on the Roundhouse, we're talking about the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad while rail fanning the Bessemer and Lake Erie. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozrak, and this is episode number 52 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we talk about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking about the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it's an iron ore hauling railroad in western Pennsylvania, founded over 100 years ago with the purpose of hauling iron ore from the lake boats coming in from Lake Erie to the steel mills in Pittsburgh, and still hauling ore, though now under the Canadian national banner. Because it is technically a fallen flag, we are looking back at its history and what it means to the area, with two guys who I'm good friends with who know so much about the railroad. First, from Bob Brooks, who has filmed the railroad extensively, and from Jon Clark, who has photographed the railroad and works for another Western Pennsylvania shortline, to talk about what this railroad means for the area. Our first guest today is not only a good friend of mine, but a rail fanning expert on the Bessemer and Lake Erie, and the primary director behind the Bessemer and Lake Erie music video. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Bob Brooks.
Hello, everybody.
What was your first memory of rail fanning the Bessemer?
Well, this started at a very early age. I would call it, and I don't know if I would call myself an expert at the Bessemer, but I appreciate the kind words there. When I was about 3 years old, I lived a block or so away from milepost 86, for those of you familiar with the railroad, on the High Line of the Bessemer in Greenville. Kind of typical, you know. I think every 3-year-old boy at the time at some point was into Thomas the Tank Engine, and at some point my parents put two and two together and said, oh, we live near the train tracks and he likes Thomas the Tank Engine. We'll run up the street at some point when a train's coming and watch a train go by. So that was really my first exposure to both trains and the Bessemer specifically. Would have been way back then. And sort of got in and out of the hobby in between then and, you know, into my teenage years. Kind of got back into it more seriously after, you know, getting reacquainted with the likes of, Jon Clark and a number of other, there's a plethora of guys I could name that kind of got me back into it more seriously.
Do you think there's a quality inherent in the Bessemer as to why you were drawn to it, or do you think it was mainly the proximity of it?
Initially, proximity. Just you're a little kid, ooh, orange and black engines or whatever. Later on, getting reacquainted with it, I think it's just everybody has their own favorite railroad, and as you should. I think for me, the Bessemer encapsulates a lot of different scenery and operations within a small amount of square miles. There's up towards Adamsville, you get I don't want to call it the plains, but the flatlands, the farms, versus you get down towards Butler and you have the steel mills and whatnot. And south of Butler, it even looks a little mountainous in some areas. So for me, having also been, it's kind of this double-edged sword where I spent a lot of time, along the Bessemer with Jon Clark. That was one aspect of it, was taking the pictures in the video and then incorporating that into, or trying to currently, into the model railroad. I just think there's a lot, for me, it's the hometown railroad, don't get me wrong. There's just a lot of, you can fit a big railroad operation reasonably into, a layout in your basement.
Scenically, there's a lot going on as well. You think you have a 140-mile-long railroad stretching from the shores of Lake Erie at Conneaut down to Pittsburgh. You have a harbor where the ore is unloaded. You have the hills. You have flatlands. You have farmland. You have forest. You have cities. You have so much in just this single railroad. Scenically, it gives you a lot of potential, whether you're a modeler or a photographer or a videographer, and that seems to be creative as well.
It was great for the video, just because it still, until just recently, Canadian National took it over in 2004, but didn't get rid of the orange engines, except for a few, until just in the past year or two. So it still had, it flew, if you went trackside, it basically flew the same flag that it did in, 1900, the same logo for over 100 years. So the traffic wasn't as intense as it was 20 years ago, but visually, it was kind of this time capsule until just recently. If you're into that, you're not chasing and you can keep up with the train and get pictures at multiple places. It was great. It was, in some cases, when they ran certain engines, it was like being back in the 70s again, which made it interesting.
Why is it that you gravitated towards video as far as how you wanted to engage with the railroad?
Well, that's simple. Because John and Chris were better at taking pictures than me. So that they are capturing a perfect, crisp, still image standing next to me in most cases. I took, basically, we had the same type of idea on composition of a photo or a video. So I just kind of took a moving picture version, in most cases, of their still image that had the picture moved and there was sound, and it's just a different, why have three of us standing next to each other taking the same picture?
When you first introduced me to the scope of your work, I was really astounded when you gave me the clips to put together this video. I think you said 6 years essentially of work in all of these separate clips over different cameras using different technology. So 6 years is about the time frame that you've been engaging with it with video?
Yeah, around, I started the video around 2004. And some of this time, I was on my own. Some of this time I was the other guy. It was just kind of, you're with different people at different times throughout the whole thing. Yeah, I started with the video in 2004. And I did still images for a while when nobody else was really around taking photos. And then I'd say around 2008 or 2007 maybe, I got back into the video again and kind of went full steam with that.
And because of this recent shift of power where within the past year, CN has replaced a lot of the orange and black with ex-Illinois Central, now you have historic video that nobody's able to quite get what you got before. And it's nifty now where what you have has that added value to it.
That was the whole point of doing it, all the miles and hours spent with that. You look back at the other railroad in Greenville was the Erie Lackawanna back in the 70s. And I think John and I were good friends in high school, and it was always kind of, can we find any pictures of the EL in Greenville? And they're always so hard to find. Personally, and I don't know what John's motivations were, but my thing was I don't want to see that happen to the Bessemer on the way out the door for the orange and black.
As you've gotten to know the railroad more, what are some of the other perspectives that you've gotten to know? Like, have you gotten to know any of the crew who work for it, what their attachment to the railroad is, or family members of those who used to work for the railroad, say in the 70s or 80s?
Yeah, I've met family members or had neighbors that worked there, and they know my interest in it. I think most of them, it's kind of split. It's just like with any railroad. There's some people that just saw it as I go to work and I come home from work and they pay me, so great. And I respect that, obviously. For some people it's just a job, and that's great. There are are obviously some people that took pride or particular interest in, the company and its history and who they worked for, and like to see that carry on, whether it's by, collecting artifacts. You can get stuff off of eBay. And so it's kind of split. You have those two camps. They either kind of, all right, I'm done with it. I'm out. I don't work there anymore. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to talk about it. Or people that retire and still have an interest in what they used to do and what the company used to do. And so you'll see people like that end up at places like the Greenville Railroad Park.
When we return to our conversation with Bob, we'll find out how he views model railroading as a form of historic preservation. First, though, we're going to go on the ground to Conneaut so that you guys get to hear a fully loaded Bessemer and Lake Erie ore train climbing Hogback Hill. That horn that you are hearing in the background is a southbound ore train led by two Illinois Central SD70s and a Canadian National SD60. They have just finished loading their ore at the harbor, and they are climbing what's called Hogback Hill. This is a really tough grade that takes these ore trains all the way from the docks in Conneaut up to a place called Albion. You've probably already seen it, but if not, I created a music video to the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad. It's a song parody of Radioactive by Imagine Dragons. I wrote it, and Bob kindly provided his video footage to create a music video for it. Now, I created this video primarily for fun, but as you'll hear in my conversation with him, it exploded in ways I could not have predicted. I was just amazed when I released the video how many people were sharing it who weren't rail fans, but just people with a passing interest in trains, or folks who were connected to the railroad because they worked for it in the past, family, or just people from the area who thought it was neat to see their hometown on film. I thought that was really interesting reaction. It seems like there's sort of this invisible family that surrounds the railroad that just doesn't ordinarily know it's there, but it was neat to see all these people come out of the woodwork who love it.
Yeah, I'd say most people in Greenville, at least the older generation, certainly know what the Bessemer was and what a critical industry it was to the town economy. Back through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and really until the early 80s. It was a major employer in town and participated in community events and sponsored things in the community. And I think at one point they had their own marching band. And my father-in-law actually played on the Bessemer softball team at one point. He didn't work there, but he was on the softball team. So it's name recognition, and right downtown. If you were in downtown Greenville, the chances were that you saw the trains go by. They were kind of hard to miss. There is a wide net of community awareness for the railroad, but that can be said for many towns across the United States. I mean, I'm sure a sizable number of Altoona residents are still aware of what the Pennsylvania Railroad is and what part that played in their community. At least I'd hope so.
I think that's true. I think the thing that perhaps separates the Bessemer from the likes of a lot of fallen flags is how recently it changed hands. A lot of the railroads that people think of as railroad towns or back in the day, their identities changed around the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. I don't think we saw a lot of major shifts in that way. And maybe I'm wrong, and folks can comment if there's a railroad that recently changed hands that was long-standing. But the Bessemer's a recent changeover, and visually super recent. So I think in some ways it's very new to the Fallen Flag family, and that's part of it as well, in terms of how recently people have memories of it.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a refueled interest in it. I'm not aware of that. Again, I've kind of, in recent years, personally, moved away from photographing it just because it's not visually what it used to be, and moved more to the modeling side of it and just creating a model railroad based on the Bessemer. So, I mean, if there is a renewed sense of it because it's a fallen flag now, visually, I would say all the better.
Agreed. Let's talk about your model, because actually, as we're recording this, we are sitting amongst the benchwork of what is going to be your Bessemer and Lake Erie empire. Talk us through what your goals are as far as your mentality with how you want to go about modeling it.
Well, I guess my goal would be just to recreate operationally, the Bessemer, and little bits of the Erie Lackawanna in there as well, to the best of my ability. I think operationally, we've talked about the scenery and the pros of that, as far as there's different kind of scenic elements that the Bessemer ran through, so that's great if you're a modeler. Operationally, the Bessemer did a lot of interesting things. I mean, let's not forget General Electric, one of, I'd say, over time, two or three big diesel locomotive manufacturers, used to ship basically all their new engines over the Bessemer. So if you're a modeler, you can go out there and basically buy every GE locomotive if you wanted to, from the 60s into the 70s and early 80s. Erie Lackawanna detour trains over the Bessemer. There were CSX coal and coke trains, and those had foreign power. I mean, you'd see BNSF engines end up on those. So you're not just, it's a shortline railroad that ran in a big time way. It's just great for modeling opportunities. So in my case, I'm modeling from Conneaut to North Bessemer and every notable area in between: Greenville, Butler, Branchton, Green Junction, eventually, the big river bridge down there at Harmerville.
Model railroading can be such a fascinating form of storytelling because, as you said, even now, the extent of the Bessemer's operations isn't near the size of what it used to be 50 or 100 years ago. So there's a way of telling the Bessemer story through film, there's a way of telling it through books, and yet there's a way of telling it through modeling when you have people come over and reenact, essentially, what that was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that those elements are another thing that led to inspiration. I've read a lot of railroad books, but of course, maybe I'm biased here. In particularly, Nate Clark and Bob Lorenzo's Bessemer in Color book, the Beaver Bessemer book from the 60s, and Tom Kramer's book from the past couple years on the Bessemer. Those have all been inspirations, both photographically, what I did trackside, and as well as what I'm doing on the layout.
When you look at the future of the Bessemer and Lake Erie, there's so much that we have no way of knowing based on what CN's continued attitude is going to be and markets and all sorts of factors beyond control. But how would you like to see its preservation expand? Select locomotives have been preserved, and there's certain museums that have some artifacts, but what are some ways in which you'd like to see future generations get to know the railroad?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what the future holds, at least for what was the Bessemer. It's a business. I mean, it's not just a toy or something for our entertainment. I mean, it is a legitimate business that CN runs day in, day out. There's one Bessemer steam locomotive preserved up in Michigan, which is a little far from home, and I've never even been to see it. I would hope that maybe somewhere there's an SD7 and at least one SD18 left. I would hope maybe an ST-38 gets preserved. That might be the best bet, depending on how the retirement of those units goes down. They're still all in use. I'd like to see that, or even a caboose, or just a black hopper car. Just something would be great. It's going to take volunteers to step up, and I don't think just one person can do that single-handedly. So I'd hope to see a collective group of people. I don't know. Maybe I'll be in that group. Who knows?
Last question I have to ask you. When I first shared with you the song that I'd written, I first played that for you, what was your immediate reaction?
Oh my goodness, he's lost his mind.
Yeah, I probably have.
Well, I think Imagine Dragons, it was a decent song on the radio. I'm not going to say, it's not my taste necessarily, but I thought it was... It's a parody. It's tongue-in-cheek. It's fun. I think, the video and the fact that you got someone that I believe specifically does Imagine Dragons covers, which is amazing to go to that length, and have him, and the fact that he recorded it for you is great. And, it stirred up interest, and hopefully the point of all this is bring back some memories, if nothing else, for some local people in the community, whether they worked for it or just had some sort of passing contact with it.
The number one thing I'm thankful for out of all of that is being able to read your stories that you've shared online. I appreciate all the shares that you've given to the video, but many of you have left stories about your connection to the railroad, and being able to read that and see how much it means has been really humbling, and I thank you so much. I thank you, Bob, for joining us here on The Rounders, and for allowing me the use of your video for such artistic purposes. It's been a really fascinating exploration of this little local railroad that we have.
Everybody's got to have their favorite railroad, but hopefully, if nothing else, it's based on how many likes and shares or whatnot it's had. It seems to have had a far-reaching impact. So hopefully maybe there's a couple people out there that know what the Bessemer is, and maybe they didn't know beforehand. And by all means, I hope that more people contact you with their stories and whatnot, because you hate to see that stuff lost. Just those stories completely lost. I've heard stories of people like me that took, well, back then it would have been slide photography, but took pictures of the railroad, and then when they were unfortunately no longer with us, those just went out to the garbage. And you think of all that history that's just gone. So it's nice that it's kind of rejuvenated some awareness about it.
And I love hearing stories about what it meant for people to be connected to the railroad, whether through just spectating as you have, or through working for it, or being connected to it by a family member. There is so much history through that, and I love exploring that history on the show. Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Nick.
Now we're out in the countryside. We're at a place called Penside, which is just a bit south of Albion. So at this point, the railroad's crested that heavy grade, and now the train is going to hit its top speed of 35 miles per hour. That is the top speed of the Bessemer all the way down to Pittsburgh. Just to set the scene for you, we've got a nice, straight, clear shot of the main line. There's a signal mast, and we have this cute little dirt road, country lane, paralleling the track. It's a very pretty scene, although that road has a lot of potholes in it. I was taking it very easy on the car because we have a good lead in front of the train. Around us, we have farmland, we have forest, we have some horses not too far away. It's just a very peaceful scene. The Bessemer goes through such interesting landscapes. Towns, cities. I mean, Bob summed it up. You see everything in this stretch of 140 miles. One of the things I'm enjoying most about being your host for the Roundhouse is discovering all of these hidden families, these community of people that may or may not be aware of each other, but gather around an entity that is important to them. That's what this music video seems to have done. It was shared over 1,500 times, which means 1,500 of you thought it was really good and wanted to show it to other people, which boggles my mind. Some of you wrote amazing comments as well, especially those of you who either used to work for the railroad or had family who did. A few comments that I want to share with you. First, from John Serrano. Great parody. I worked for Bessemer in Greenville and actually got to turn engines on the turntable back in the early 80s, fueled them, plus put sand in during the winter months. This from Shirley Curtin. I love this so much. My mother and brothers would sometimes go to pick up Dad from the Greenville shop at 3 p.m. and take him home. Such sweet memories. I love railroads and the stories about the work, those who worked the railroad, and the families of those men. Kathy Hassler writes, my father, Paul Whaley, retired as a lieutenant of police for the Bessemer, as did his father and his uncles. The railroad provided a good life for the Whaley family. And lastly, this comment from Diane Waters. Song choice was perfect and brought back many memories for me. As I watched the video, I couldn't help but remember all the stories my dad would share. I cried, of course, from missing him, but at the same time, I felt blessed knowing a huge part of his life and many others is not forgotten and continues to live on. The history is so important, not just of the Bessemer, but of all these railroads. And I work so hard to make sure that all of the stories of you guys out there who work for the railroad, who engage in this hobby or this industry, are preserved because they matter. The fact that this fun music video seems to have tapped into that is amazing. Our next guest today is a lifelong fan of the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, originally hailing from Greenville and now working for the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Jon Clark.
Hi, Nick. How you doing?
Doing good, John. The first question, which seems like an obvious one, is because you're such a fan of the Bessemer, why is it that you're working for the BNP?
Well, I dabbled around in some different things. You know, when I graduated high school, like you say, I was from Greenville. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with myself. Did a little bit of college, did some time in the military. Yeah, I actually applied for a position, a conductor's position with Canadian National out of Greenville, job in my hometown. And, you know, I thought I'd give railroading a try. It was something I was interested in, but I never heard back from them. And I had some friends who worked for the BNP who told me that there were some openings. So I put my name in the hat over there, and I ended up getting hired on over on that side of things. So it was just kind of a luck of the draw kind of thing.
Luck of the draw, indeed. What is your first memory of ever rail fanning the Bessemer?
Oh, the first one, it's hard to say because, I mean, you know, even as far back as when I was a little kid, my grandparents lived in the Greenville area in a retirement community up there, and I'd go visit them with my dad on the weekends. You could hear the Bessemer trains coming through town, coming across the High Line because they'd be on a pretty steep pull there, so they were, you know, in heavy throttle, and you could hear the engines coming for miles. And it was a common occurrence for us to hop in the car, and, you know, they thought it was a cool thing. You know, they will take the kid out and show him the train. You know, little kids like trains. You know, I can remember many times going out just to watch them go by as early as the mid-'90s. And so it's kind of hard to really remember what my first memory of it is because, you know, I was a pretty young kid at that time. I'm talking, you know, like 3 or 4 years old, riding around in the back seat of my dad or my grandpa's car. But I remember many times seeing Bessemer trains in the Greenville area and elsewhere when I was a kid.
Your dad was also a lifelong Bessemer fan, even wrote the book, so to speak.
Yeah, he did. My dad, he actually drew a Bessemer paycheck for a brief period of time during his college years. Bessemer would enlist summer help when they were doing track maintenance blitzes in the good weather months, and he was in college and had the summer off, so he worked as a track maintainer installing rail on the Western Allegheny branch back in the late 70s. He also, later on, spent many years taking photographs of freight trains going, all over the Bessemer. He and his friend whom he met trackside over the years, Bob Lorenzo, in 94 published a book through Morning Sun Productions about the Bessemer. And, if you haven't read the book and you're interested in the Bessemer, it's a must read if you're trying to learn about it, or if, you just want to see how it was back in the day. It's a really good publication about that.
One of the interesting aspects to me, as I'm becoming more aware of Bessemer and Lake Erie fandom, is that unlike a lot of railroads where I think the emphasis is on the steam era, which the Bessemer certainly had a long steam era going back into the 1800s, but a lot of the fandom is from the diesel era, when they initially got their first F units onwards through a whole host of EMD products. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, my, I guess I'll say observation of how people's interest in things goes is it's totally situationally dependent. Someone who never spent any time around steam engines isn't going to really have a whole lot of interest in steam engines because it's not what they know. I'm interested in the latter era of the Bessemer just because that's when I was around it. I remember fondly the days when I would go out and see it and the people who were associated with it and whatnot. And I think that's the case with most people. They recollect their own experiences.
As you went through the years, as you started to grow up, what were some of the different ways in which you engaged with the railroad? How did you express your admiration for it?
My experience with the Bessemer was mainly taking photographs of it. I lived in close enough proximity to it that I could hear them coming for a while, and I eventually ended up living in Greenville as well. So, I lived in a different part of town than my grandparents. I had a couple of friends from high school who were also interested in it. And when we'd hear them coming, we'd hop in the car and go out and follow along with them. And there's lots of scenic areas around the Greenville area, farmland and whatnot, that makes for some pretty photogenic photography. And the Bessemer seemed to run at good times of the day where they were in nice lighting, presented for some pretty good photography. And that, to me, was very satisfying to go out and experience all of that. Beyond the photography, I've always had an interest in locomotives. I always thought that the Bessemer's locomotive fleet was interesting, and that tying in with the photography, it's always something to do. You look and see what locomotives were on the train. I've never taken a picture of that one before or something. And eventually you'd get them all. There was only so many. A lot of good times were had out there.
You could really lose yourself in a day of rail fanning because the main line is about 140 miles from the shores of Lake Erie in Conneaut down to Pittsburgh. So you start your day in Conneaut, wait for the northbound empties to get in. Then once it leaves for south, you could just keep going and keep going with it. It's big enough to give you quite a substantial chase, but small enough that you feel like you could chase the whole thing.
Oh yeah, you can easily spend an entire day out with a camera following the Bessemer around. As long as you start your day, with wherever the train is, and you stick with the train, you're going to have one heck of a day. Oftentimes, the problem is finding the train. You can stick with it as long as you want. If you only have a little bit of time, as long as you, like I say, as long as you find the train, follow it as far as you feel you can and break off, or, heck, if you wanted to, you could follow it all the way south until you run out of daylight.
One of the ways in which you engaged in modeling the Bessemer was through train simulators. you started up your own virtual locomotive works, so to speak, and talk about that a bit.
I didn't really have a place to have model trains. I mean, I had a couple of little models, that I had here and there, but I didn't have the ability to, like have a workstation where I could paint my own models, like a lot of people do. Some people are into model cars or something, and that was something I always thought was cool, was model trains. And, since I didn't have the facilities to really do anything myself, found ways to do it on the computer with like 3D modeling and whatnot. And that was how I got started with that.
I think what's nice about the train simulation as well is it's a different way of getting up close and personal with these locomotives. Folks like us who live in Western Pennsylvania, we could get out there, we could see the real things, but still to have an element of it where now we can be behind the throttle, that adds another layer of enjoyment.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely does. Especially, like when I started out with it, I was probably just, like 13 or 14 years old on my computer at home. It was a way to connect with things like that. But it also, to me, was a way to, I guess you could say, connect with the history of it. You can kind of turn it into a bit of a time machine. You have the ability to operate locomotives that have been scrapped, try to replicate details of things that you've seen in photographs to your liking. It has a lot of freedom without a lot of cost. It only costs you the time and the knowledge.
And here's the thing that Jon's downplaying, folks. He could tell you all of the specifics, especially of the SD38s that they had on their roster. He could tell you the specifics about what type of light it had, when that light was added or removed, and which models still exist, which ones were scrapped. He knows these locomotives back to front.
Well, yeah, I got a head full of random useless knowledge like that. But, you spend enough time around something, you get familiar with it. I never worked for the Bessemer, so my perspective on it is just simply from the outside looking in. It's a different type of familiarity to it than somebody who spent every day out there working on these things, making their living or maintaining them or anything like that. They had a lot of meaning to a lot of people. So, my perspective of it is just, it's kind of one-sided.
What's interesting about it is that so many people around here in Western Pennsylvania do have very strong connections with this railroad. When I created the video and I put it online, I was amazed at how many non-rail fans were responding to it, either because they'd previously worked for it, they still work for it, they had family who did, or they're just from the area and they like seeing shots of their hometown or parts of the line that they drive by. That sense of community that exists around it, I don't know if it's unusual to the Bessemer specifically, but it certainly has heart to it.
Oh, yeah. Having spent a good bit of my my youth growing up in Greenville, the Bessemer was a major employer in that town. You didn't have to be a railroad enthusiast to have some sort of connection to the Bessemer. I won't say most, but there was a lot of people that I went to school with who their parents worked for the Bessemer or something. A lot of the people in the town that I knew had, relatives that, oh yeah, my uncle or somebody used to work in the car shop or something like that. And the Bessemer, it was comprised of the community. There were other employers in town, and the Bessemer was definitely one of the biggest. It seemed to be the kind of company where they, the employees were a big family back in the day, when that was just kind of a way of life, for those people to work for the railroad.
Earlier, you used the term conveyor belt. And in some ways, I think that is a perfect description of the Bessemer because it's essentially a conveyor belt of get the ore to the mills. Has been always their primary source of freight and revenue. And it has the connections to U.S. Steel and to Andrew Carnegie. But at the same time, even though it's sort of built from these giants, there's a way in which it's a little giant, because it's not a massive railroad. It never was a massive railroad. There's an element of it where it's relatable. You could connect to it. That I think is sometimes more challenging with the Class 1 railroads, where they're just such big entities.
Yeah, the Bessemer, in a lot of ways, the term you used was kind of a little giant, borrowing that from the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. That was their slogan. But the Bessemer very much so was as well. They hauled an immense amount of traffic over a relatively short distance. One of their primary commodities they hauled over the years was iron ore. They still haul iron ore there. They also had a lot of online coal mines, interchange traffic with other railroads across the route. Years ago, it provided for an immense amount of traffic, almost entirely unit train commodities. So, I mean, it was a pretty lucrative business. That's the best business to run in the railroad industry. If you can move bulk commodities, it makes the most money. The Bessemer really was a pretty impressive operation back in its day.
It's still impressive in a way. It's just very different. When Canadian National bought out the conglomerate of railroads, of which the Bessemer and Lake Erie was one of them, in 2004, it's not that it changed overnight. In some ways, it's amazing how much things stayed the same for many years after the takeover. You'd look at the railroad from an outsider's perspective, as you say, and you saw the same engines and the same cars, and visually, not much had really changed. It wasn't until the past couple of years that a lot of the orange power was shipped off to other parts of the network.
Yeah, that's true. When CN took over, it was pretty much a takeover of the operations. I remember when that happened, and we were all pretty sure that, that was the end of our experience relating to the Bessemer as we knew it. And we didn't really know what they were going to do with the place, since it doesn't connect to their greater rail network. They ended up basically just operating it as is. And because of that, the changes that occurred to it were very, very slow. As far as locomotives, it took almost a little over 11 years, I believe, for them to finally get rid of the Bessemer engines as the motive power on the road trains. The changes beyond that have been slow but sure. There's been a lot of sidings and yards that were there for 100 years that, really didn't have a use because, mines had closed down a long time ago and things like that. And a lot of that extra trackage that was just laying around dormant has been removed. A lot of the people who worked for the Bessemer have retired. There's not as many guys working there nowadays for CN that, were around back when it was still the Bessemer. But there has definitely been a slow, steady change of the guard.
When we return to our interview with Jon, we ask him what artifacts of the Bessemer's history are most important to preserve. The Bessemer is an exciting chase. Hear that thunder in the background? We're driving through Conneautville right now. Don't worry, I have both hands on the wheel. The microphone's fastened to the seat. But we are pacing the train right now. We're doing the speed limit too, so don't worry about that. But it's exciting to be driving along the road and the train is thundering right next to us as I speak. The route of the railroad, at least in the northern half, there's this road that parallels a lot of the line, helps to make it an easy chase, but it also puts you in very close proximity with the railroad too, especially through towns like Conneautville. We're trying to catch it before either Meadville Junction or Hartstown, both of which are classic shots for Bessemer and Lake Erie fans. This is it. We're upon Cremis. Crew changes just happened. New crew is on the train, and we're getting underway. Now back to our interview with Jon. In some ways, you're right when you say that you're an outsider looking in and that you've never been a Bessemer employee yourself. But I don't think that's entirely true. You do work for a railroad of a little bit bigger size than the Bessemer. I forget what the BMP's total track mileage is, but you work for a railroad now, and that interest to work for a railroad came from your interest in trains. Now that you work for a railroad, what does it mean to you when you see other rail fans appreciating your railroad?
Oh, that's kind of an interesting question. It is interesting to be on the other side of that situation, from the looking through the other side of the glass in the locomotives. I see somebody out watching my train go by. I guess I kind of think of them in the same position as I was when I was a kid, finding the interest in their own experience. And that'll be, if it's something that they catch on to and enjoy for the long term, they'll look back on those times when they went down to the tracks and saw that train go by. That'll be the thing that they're interested in. It is interesting to see people out and about, and they're not even necessarily all rail fans. It's fun to interact with the people in the towns you go through. Like for example, there's a guy that lives in a house along the tracks through this one town we operate through. Every time the train goes by, he's an older fella. He comes out to the window and flashes his porch lights at us, and everybody always blows the horn at him when we go by. That's part of being qualified on the territory. You got to know where everybody is who comes out to wave at you and go by, and it's neat to have that element of community. When you think about the fact that something like the Bessemer, where in this day and age, 97% of their operations are ore-centric, they still do have other customers, but the primary thing is just empty hoppers up, loaded hoppers down. And when we've talked about your work on the BNP, it seems like there's times when there can kind of be the same thing over and over. Does the monotony ever get to you, or is there always something that keeps it unique even where you're always on familiar territory? I guess that answer can be kind of broad. Every day you go to work is going to be different. Obviously, I don't go to work just because I like trains. I go to work because I'm there to make a living, just like the guys who work there who aren't railroad enthusiasts. You have good days and bad days. Even from a guy like me who's interested in this stuff, more times than not, I'd say I'm ready to go home at the end of the day. Especially, if you've been there for 12 hours, you get tired. The job wears you down. But on the other side of that, there are good days. Everything's going right and you're having a good day, and there's a sense of satisfaction in that. You're not an expendable job. You're there, you're providing a service for a customer that needs something delivered to them, and you're providing that. There's an element of satisfaction in that. I've always really appreciated that aspect of the job. Now that you do this for a living, you go back to the modeling. You yourself aren't as heavy into model railroading as others, but we both know quite a few people in this area who model the Bessemer and Lake Erie in some scale or form. How does it feel to be doing these operating sessions and playing with these toy trains when now you have the tools to do it for real, so to speak? It's always fun to go to somebody's layout. If you got a bunch of people that are, they understand operations, and you get together and you run the railroad. It's neat to see it come to life. Being a railroader, like you're mentioning, different people that have layouts, even that pertain to the Bessemer. I always thought that the Bessemer would have been a cool railroad to work for just because their operations are neat. Seeing that come to life in a model railroad, knowing a little bit about how to operate, it's fun. It's satisfying. If you've never done it, kind of hard to explain. It's just the kind of thing where you got to be there to see how it works. Looking at the future, it's obviously impossible to predict what CN's continued attitude is going to be toward the Bessemer in this day and age where anything could happen. But what we do know is that there are a lot of people who care about preserving the history of this railroad.
From your perspective, what is your greatest wish as far as what you would like to see preserved from the Bessemer's history?
Well, I think any element of the history that can be preserved should be preserved. That requires having the people with the resources and time available to do it. There's not a lot of Bessemer equipment that is preserved. There's a lot of it that's still operating around the country now that CN has scattered a lot of stuff. But I'd like to see a Bessemer engine preserved somewhere. It'd be neat to see one come back to Greenville and be put on display or something to that effect. But who knows what's going to happen as far as that in the long run. A lot of those situations are kind of luck of the draw. I guess we'll see. We'll see who's around and available to make those kinds of things happen.
It's shocking how many of the Bessemer and Lake Erie's F units survive. That was their first primary diesel road power. They never had a passenger train to use them with, ironically. I mean, they were built to be streamliners, never saw passenger service in their working life. And yet, a ton of them have survived into preservation. You look on websites that have the Bessemer and Lake Erie diesel rosters, so many of those F units have survived, and yet none of them are painted Bessemer. It's quite funny. You'll have ones in New Jersey painted for, I believe it's Lehigh Valley. They're everywhere. There's one painted as Baltimore and Ohio, and yet none is Bessemer.
Yeah, it always kind of seemed interesting to me, too, that so many of those engines. I mean, I would say there's probably a dozen of them around, and there was a lot of them. 701 through 728 and 701 to 726 all had B units. So that's a pretty extensive roster of locomotives. There's probably a little less than a quarter of them around. I haven't actually really thought about the numbers before. But yeah, it is interesting that the ones that do exist have just been used basically as a canvas for whoever owns them's favorite railroad to paint them in. It's unfortunate that none of them are preserved as their original owner. And it is interesting that you bring up that they were never used in passenger service. They were exclusively used in freight service. The Bessemer's passenger diesel power were SD7s, which were purchased later on. But I think the F units, they got into the dieselization pretty early on. Now, that was before EMD was offering any six-axle locomotives like the SD7s, which probably would have been better suited for their heavy drag operations that they had, moving the ore and coal. The F units, they certainly served their purpose over the years, bridge the gap between the steam era and the diesel era.
Reliable locomotives, and they've lasted a while. Some of them were still on the roster in the 90s even.
Yeah, I think the last one was struck from the roster in 2000, like early 2000. There was a few of them that were used as radio control locomotives up at the docks in Conneaut. Yeah, it is pretty amazing to think that they lasted that long, from the 50s into the next century.
A lot of historic rail fandom is based around the pieces of equipment that generations before us have worked to preserve, and that's kind of set for what it is because none of that's being used on Class 1s anymore. That's all tucked away in museums, and it's kind of a fixed thing. So now here we have the latest addition to a fallen flag that hasn't quite settled into that same scheme, if you know what I mean. What do you think are going to be the ways in which that transition happens? How did you see that preservation occurring in terms of what has already been preserved? What do we have now? And what do you think we might be able to get in the future, 10, 20 years down the road?
Well, I guess, like I was saying earlier, I mean, that all is very dependent on the people who are in position with the means to do anything about it. That requires time, effort, and money. It's hard to say who's going to be around to do that. And the other part of that is you have to have a place to go with equipment. Railroad equipment is big. It requires a lot of maintenance. There's really not a whole lot of railroad museums in the greater area around where the Bessemer operated. So I think that's why you don't see a lot of engines or other equipment like that preserved on a large scale.
Well, what I'm getting at, John, is I think I'm not going to be surprised if 10 years from now on the show I'm breaking the news that you've bought an SD38 and you're working to have it preserved. That will not surprise me in the slightest.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be looking to buy a locomotive. That's a pretty big cost to incur, and I don't know if I'd ever have the time doing what I do to do something like that. But I would hope to see somebody preserve something like that someday.
It's tricky to encapsulate the history. That's the number one challenge that I see, and it's always interesting to see how people go about it. We all know another guy by the name of Ed Cronin who had not just a fantastic Bessemer layout, but recreated the dispatching panel for it. There's ways in which I feel this model railroading, and the fact that they've been willing to share that with us is great, because then we get to experience those operations from another perspective, which is great for us because we live near them. Trick is to share that with even more people.
Yeah, absolutely. Going to Cronin's was always a really good time, like you were mentioning, because he had the dispatch center, and you get somebody, like myself, I'm interested in operating things the way it would have operated. And he really had a pretty unique platform for being able to do that. There is an element of preserving the history through those types of avenues, just because it would be difficult to preserve things like locomotives because they're big and you got to put them somewhere and they're expensive. Whereas a model railroad can certainly be expensive. The space issue is put it in your house. You can put it wherever you can fit it, wherever you can build it. You can make it out of wood and models, that you can hold in your hand. You can create the history of however you remember it, however you want to. There's a lot of flexibility to it.
Out of everything that you've done with the Bessemer, whether it be your photography, train simulation modeling, or the fact that it's connected you with Bessemer crew, you've made friends through it, what are you most thankful for that's come out of your appreciation for this railroad?
It's kind of hard to narrow that down to one thing. The people are obviously important aspect of that. It's always cool to get to talk to the guys when I'd see them out and about. And, a lot of them knew my dad when he was a kid. They kind of had an idea who I was. You're Jon Clark. Oh, Nate's your dad, huh? He's the guy that wrote the book a few years ago. And that's always been cool. But just above everything, the memories of it, what was going on in my backyard. And I have a lot of attachment to when I was a kid to that and what I was doing back then. And I look back on it fondly.
I love the fact that even as a fan, if you really appreciate a railroad, you feel like you're a part of something that's bigger than you. John, thank you for joining us here on the Roundhouse and sharing how much the Bessemer has meant to you. This has been an interesting exploration of it because it is such a difficult thing to nail down. It's that big question of why we do what we do, but it's always interesting to kind of chip away at the pieces, and certainly seeing the amount of love that there's been for this railroad, it's been quite astounding. So thank you for coming on the show and sharing that with us.
No problem, Nick.
And now, the question of the day.
Before we get to the question of the day, I just want to throw in there that I did have an excellent time chasing the Bessemer and managed to chase that train all the way from Conneaut down to Butler. Didn't quite make Pittsburgh, but I do have all of the photos from that chase in the show notes for this episode number 52 on theroundhouse.com. Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to the president of the National Model Railroad Association, and I asked you guys, how would you like to see the future of model railroading develop? Mike Lawn responds saying, "Dead rail seems like an interesting development. Would love to see that concept drafted down to HO and N scales. Eliminating the fear of wiring a full layout and operating engines independently would create prototypical interest." A lot of you guys out there agreed with Mike. Battery power seems like the way of the future, not having to worry about keep your tracks clean. It seems very interesting, still experimental, but that is definitely worth following. This from Dylan Hale. Honestly, better track systems. Albeit FlexTrack is cool and all, sometimes it's a pain to work with, especially if you're a beginner or your high school tries to expel you for bringing track cutters. I also want HO super elevated curves in some sort of ready-to-use fashion. Lastly, from Sean Murphy, to answer your question on the future of model railroading, digital media that is free, high quality, and readily available is the best way to expand the hobby. Your podcast, among others, YouTube channels, online groups, and online publications such as Model Railroad Hobbyist are really leading the hobby to its bright new future. Person-to-person contact is best if you have the time and can afford the plane flight, yet I could talk to any number of experts on a niche subject. Great Northern locomotive assignments from 1954 to 1964 currently. Anywhere in the world, thanks to the internet. Definitely agree with you, Sean, and the internet is what makes this show happen. Thanks to the internet, I get to talk with really amazing folks out there. I get to talk with you guys. We get to cover very interesting subjects. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is your favorite railroad to chase? Alternatively, I would love to hear more Bessemer and Lake Erie stories. If you've got them, send them in. Let me know. TheRoundhousePodcast.com, links to social media there. And believe me, guys, we will be covering the Bessemer and Lake Erie more in the future. There is plenty of history that we are discovering, and it is very exciting indeed. Thanks for joining us here on the show, and remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.
Whoa, I'm changing crews.